When you hear the name Genghis Khan, what image comes to mind? Perhaps a bloodthirsty barbarian on horseback, sweeping across the steppes in a tide of unstoppable destruction. The popular image is one of ruthless savagery, a man who built mountains of skulls and left nothing but ash in his wake. But this picture, while containing fragments of truth, misses the far more fascinating reality. The real story of how Genghis Khan and his Mongols conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history is not simply a tale of superior violence. It is a story of revolutionary military innovation, brilliant strategic thinking, and a meritocratic system that transformed a collection of feuding nomadic tribes into the most efficient war machine the medieval world had ever seen. So tonight, we will journey back to the 13th century, to the windswept grasslands of Mongolia. We will follow the rise of a boy named Temujin, born into a world of brutal clan warfare and constant survival, who would transform himself into Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. We will experience life on the Mongol campaign trail, learn the revolutionary tactics that made their armies unbeatable, and discover how they built an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. But before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps support the channel and is very appreciated. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really enjoy hearing from you in the comments. Now, settle in, let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time of leather saddles, composite bows, and an empire born on the back of the fastest horses the world had ever known. The story of the greatest conqueror in history does not begin with glory. It begins with a boy alone on the frozen steppe, hunted, abandoned, and fighting simply to survive another day. The year is approximately 1167, though the exact date is lost to history. You were born in the harsh grasslands near the Onon River in what is now Mongolia. Your name is Temujin, given to you by your father, Yasuge, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan. The name means blacksmith, taken from a rival warrior your father had recently defeated. This is the Mongol custom. You carry the name of the enemy to demonstrate the strength of the victor. From your first breath, you enter a world that knows no mercy. The Mongolian plateau is a vast, unforgiving landscape. In the summer, the grasslands stretch endlessly under a brutal sun, the only shade provided by the occasional gnarled tree. In the winter, the temperature plummets to depths that can freeze a man solid in his saddle. The wind never stops. It howls across the open steppe, carrying with it the smell of horses, dust, and the distant smoke of cooking fires. This is a world without cities, without farms, without permanent shelter of any kind. Your people are nomads, living in felt tents called gers, following the seasonal migration of their herds. Life revolves entirely around animals: horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels. They provide everything: meat, milk, leather, wool, and transportation. Without them, there is no life. A Mongol child learns to ride before they can properly walk. By the age of 3, you are already sitting in a saddle, your small hands gripping the mane of a pony. By the age of 5, you are expected to ride well enough to help tend the herds. Falling off is not met with sympathy, but with a sharp rebuke. The steppe does not forgive weakness. Your world is governed not by written laws, but by ancient customs and the brutal reality of survival. Power belongs to the strongest clan, the best warrior, the man who can protect his people and expand his herds through raids on weaker neighbors. Loyalty is paramount, but it is a conditional thing. Men follow a leader only as long as he is successful. A single defeat, a poor decision, a moment of weakness, and his followers will abandon him for a stronger protector. This is the world into which you are born, a world of constant low-level warfare, blood feuds that span generations, and shifting alliances based entirely on pragmatism. There is no central authority, no Khan of all Mongols. The steppe is a patchwork of rival tribes: the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Kerites, all competing for grazing land, horses, and survival itself. When you are only 9 years old, everything changes. Your father has arranged a marriage for you, a common practice to secure alliances. He takes you to the camp of your future bride's family, the Olkunut tribe, where you are betrothed to a girl named Borte, a year older than you with sharp, intelligent eyes. The agreement is made, and you are left with her family as a kind of apprentice, learning their ways. Your father begins the long ride back to his own camp, but he never makes it home. On the journey, he encounters a group of Tatars, ancient enemies of your clan. They recognize him, and in an act of treacherous hospitality, they invite him to share a meal. The food is poisoned. By the time he reaches his camp, Yasuge is writhing in agony. Within days, he is dead. The news reaches you, and you are summoned back immediately. You return to find your world shattered. With your father gone, the fragile authority of your family evaporates overnight. The men of your father's small clan refuse to follow a widow with young children. They pack up their jers, round up their animals, and simply leave. Your mother, Hoelun, a woman of fierce pride and iron will, pleads with them to stay. They ignore her. One elder turns his back and rides away, calling over his shoulder that they will not be led by a woman and children. You are left with almost nothing. Your mother, your younger brothers and sister, and a handful of animals. No protectors, no allies, no herds to speak of. In the brutal hierarchy of the steppe, you have become nobodies, fair game for any stronger clan. This is the lowest point of your life, a childhood spent on the very edge of survival. Your family scrapes by on whatever they can find. You dig roots from the frozen earth, catch small fish in the river, and hunt marmots with crude traps. The constant gnawing hunger becomes your closest companion. Your mother holds the family together through sheer will, teaching you and your brothers that survival is not shameful, it is victory. You learn to endure cold that numbs your fingers, hunger that makes your stomach cramp, and the ever-present fear that a rival clan will decide you are worth robbing or killing. It is during this desperate time that the first hint of your future character emerges. Your half-brother Begta, older and stronger, begins to assert dominance over the meager resources you have. He steals fish you have caught, takes the best portions of food, and belittles you in front of your younger brothers. For a Mongol, this is not simply cruelty, it is a challenge to your place in the hierarchy. One day, after Begta steals a bird you have shot with an arrow, something inside you snaps. You and your full brother Kasar make a decision. You track Begta to a hillside where he sits watching the horses. You approach from two directions, arrows already nocked. He sees you coming and understands immediately. He does not run. He meets your eyes and speaks a final sentence, asking you not to harm the younger children. Then you and Kasar release your arrows. Begta falls, and the deed is done. You have killed your own half-brother. When your mother learns what you have done, she is horrified. She screams at you, calling you a destroyer, a beast without honor. But in the brutal calculus of the steppe, you have done what was necessary. You have established that you are not to be challenged. You are the head of this family now. But your survival is far from assured. Word of your existence and your actions reaches the Taichiud clan, former allies of your father, who now see you as a potential threat. A boy who kills his own brother might grow into a man who seeks revenge for past slights. They decide to eliminate the problem before it grows. One night, a raiding party descends on your camp. You try to flee into the forest, but they hunt you down. You are captured, fitted with a heavy wooden kang around your neck, a cruel device that prevents you from feeding yourself or lying down comfortably. You are dragged back to their camp as a prisoner, a warning to others. For weeks, you are paraded as a captive, a living symbol of your family's fall. You are guarded closely, beaten, humiliated, and left to sleep in the mud. But you do not break. You watch. You wait. You learn patience. Then, during a great feast when the guards are drunk and distracted, you make your move. Using the heavy kangu as a weapon, you strike one of your captors in the head, stunning him, and bolt into the darkness. You run through the camp and dive into a nearby river, submerging yourself in the cold water with only your face above the surface, hidden among the reeds. The camp erupts in chaos. Torches flare, men shout, search parties scatter in every direction. But one man, a lowly herdsman named Sorkin Shearer, sees you hiding in the river. He meets your eyes, and then he walks away without saying a word. Hours later, when the search parties have moved on, he returns. He pulls you from the water, takes you to his ger, and hides you under a pile of wool. His family feeds you, warms you, and when the moment is right, they give you a horse and send you on your way. This act of unexpected mercy from a stranger is a lesson you never forget. Loyalty, even from the lowliest person, is worth more than gold. You make your way back to your family, and in the years that follow, you begin the slow, dangerous work of building power. You are still a young man, perhaps 16 or 17, but the years of hardship have forged you into something different. You are not the strongest warrior on the steppe, you are not the richest, but you are something perhaps more valuable. You are cunning, patient, and able to see the larger game. Your first move is to reclaim your betrothed, Borte. You travel back to her family and complete the marriage. She is no decorative bride. She is an intelligent, strong-willed woman who becomes your closest advisor and the mother of your heirs. Her family, seeing potential in you, provides a wedding gift of a rare and valuable black sable coat. This coat becomes a key piece in your next move. You take the coat and travel to the camp of Togrul, the Khan of the powerful Kerite tribe. Togrul had once been an ally of your father, sworn brothers in the Mongol tradition of Anda. You present the coat as a gift and invoke the old bond, offering your service in exchange for his protection. Togrul, an aging but still formidable leader, accepts. You now have a powerful patron, but your rise is immediately tested. Soon after your marriage, while you are away from camp, a Merkit raiding party attacks. They are seeking revenge for an old wrong. Decades earlier, your father had stolen your mother, Holan, from a Merkit tribesman on her wedding day. The Merkits have not forgotten. They cannot reach your father, so they take the next best thing. They kidnap Borte, dragging her away as spoils of war. For you, this is not just a personal loss. It is a public humiliation that threatens your fragile new status. If you cannot even protect your own wife, why would any warrior follow you? You do not rage, you plan. You go immediately to Togrul and invoke his promise of support. You also reach out to Jamuka, your childhood friend, a charismatic and ambitious leader in his own right. Together, you assemble a combined force and launch a coordinated rescue raid on the Merkit camp. It is swift and brutal. The Merkits are caught by surprise. You recover Borte, along with many captives and herds. This is your first real military success, and it establishes your reputation. You are a man who keeps his word, who honors his debts, and who strikes decisively when wronged. Word begins to spread. In the wake of this victory, warriors begin to drift to your camp. They are not motivated by loyalty to your bloodline or your clan. They come because they see something in you. A man who shares plunder fairly, who listens to counsel, and who rewards skill over birth. This is revolutionary. Traditional Mongol society is rigidly hierarchical, dominated by aristocratic clans who inherit power. You begin to build something different. Your growing band is a meritocracy. A herder's son who proves himself in battle can rise to command. A former enemy who swears loyalty is given the same opportunities as a blood relative. This openness attracts the ambitious, the dispossessed, and the hungry. Your camp swells. For a time, you and Jamuka campaign together as sworn brothers. But the seeds of future conflict are already present. Jamuka is a traditionalist, a man who believes in the old aristocratic order. You are building something new, and it threatens his vision of how the world should work. The break comes suddenly. After a minor dispute during a shared camp, Jamuka makes a veiled threat. That night, you and your followers quietly pack up and leave, splitting your forces. This is the beginning of a long and bitter rivalry that will define the next stage of your life. Over the following years, the steppe becomes a chessboard, and you are learning to play the game at the highest level. You form alliances, win battles, suffer devastating defeats, and rebuild. You are betrayed, captured, and at one point, left for dead with an arrow in your neck. But you survive. You always survive. And slowly, methodically, you are uniting the tribes under your banner. The turning point comes in the year 1206. After decades of warfare, you have finally defeated or absorbed all the major rival tribes. The Tatars, who poisoned your father, have been annihilated. The Merkits, who kidnapped your wife, have been scattered. Even Jamuka, your old friend and greatest rival, has been captured and executed at his own request. asking to die without spilling his blood, an honorable death. You call for a great assembly, a kurultai, on the banks of the Onon River, near the place where you were born. Leaders from across the steppe gather, thousands of warriors, shamans, and chieftains. There, in a ceremony rich with ritual and symbolism, you are proclaimed Genghis Khan, a title that means universal ruler or oceanic ruler, a man whose authority is as vast as the sea. You are no longer Temujin, the boy who scraped for survival. You are the Khan of all Mongols. But you are not content to simply rule the steppe. You have a vision of an empire that stretches beyond the horizon, and you have built the tool to achieve it. An army unlike any the world has ever seen. The Mongol army that Genghis Khan unleashed upon the world was not simply a horde of wild horsemen charging mindlessly into battle. It was a sophisticated, highly disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient military machine built on revolutionary principles that would change the nature of warfare forever. To understand how the Mongols conquered the world, you must first understand the weapon at their disposal. The foundation of Mongol power was the horse. Not just any horse, but the small, stocky, almost ugly Mongol pony. These animals were perfectly adapted to the harsh steppe environment. They could survive on grass alone, digging through snow with their hooves to find forage in the winter. They required no grain, no elaborate stables, no blacksmiths to shoe them. They were incredibly tough, able to travel up to 60 miles in a single day while carrying a fully armed rider. A Mongol warrior did not ride one horse. He brought a string of 3, 4, or even 5 mounts on campaign, rotating between them to keep them fresh. This meant that a Mongol army could move at speeds that seemed impossible to their enemies. While a European army might march 10 to 15 miles a day, weighed down by supply wagons and infantry, the Mongols could cover 60 miles or more, appearing where they were least expected, striking and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Every Mongol male was a warrior. From the age of 3, boys learned to ride. By adolescence, they could shoot a bow from the saddle at full gallop, a skill that took years of constant practice to master. The Mongol composite bow was a masterpiece of engineering, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, capable of firing arrows over 300 yards with enough force to penetrate armor. Unlike European knights who relied on the devastating but clumsy charge of heavy cavalry, Mongol warriors fought as light horse archers. They would ride in, unleash volleys of arrows, and wheel away before the enemy could close. They perfected the feigned retreat, pretending to flee in disorder, luring overconfident enemies into ambushes where they would be surrounded and cut to pieces. But the true genius of the Mongol military was in its organization. Genghis Khan revolutionized the traditional tribal structure. He broke apart the old clan loyalties that had kept the steppe divided and reorganized the entire army on a strict decimal system. The basic unit was the arban, a squad of 10 men. 10 arbans made a zun, a company of 100. 10 zuns made a mingan, 1,000 men. And 10 mingans made a tumen, the famous unit of 10,000, the heavy hammer of Mongol warfare. This system allowed for unprecedented coordination. Orders could flow down the chain of command with clarity and speed. Each level of leadership knew exactly who they commanded and what was expected of them. More importantly, these units were not based on tribal or family ties. They were mixed groups, deliberately chosen to break old loyalties and create new ones based entirely on the army itself. A man's arban became his family. His loyalty was no longer to his birth tribe, but to his unit and his Khan. Genghis Khan also established an elite personal guard, the keshig, composed of the sons of his generals and the most talented warriors from across the empire. These men served as his bodyguards, but also as a leadership academy. They learned strategy, administration, and the Khan's vision for the empire. When they were ready, they were sent out to command tumens of their own, spreading the Mongol way of warfare across the growing empire. Promotion in the Mongol army was based purely on merit. A man from the humblest herder family could, if he proved himself in battle, rise to command thousands. This was unheard of in the feudal societies of China, Persia, or Europe, where noble birth was the primary requirement for command. The Mongols promoted based on skill, bravery, and results. This created an officer corps of astonishing competence. Discipline was absolute. Genghis Khan codified his laws in the Yasa, a legal code that governed everything from military conduct to daily life. The punishment for cowardice in battle was death. The punishment for desertion was death. But the punishment for looting before a victory was complete was also death. Mongol armies did not break ranks to plunder. They fought as a unified force until the enemy was destroyed, and only then were the spoils divided according to rank and contribution. This level of discipline shocked their enemies, who were used to armies that dissolved into chaotic mobs at the first sight of treasure. The Mongols also mastered the art of intelligence and psychological warfare. Before launching a campaign, they would send out spies, merchants, and scouts to gather detailed information about the enemy. They learned about the political divisions, the strength of fortifications, the location of resources, and the character of enemy commanders. They spread terror deliberately, allowing refugees to flee from conquered cities to spread stories of Mongol brutality. The message was clear: resist and face annihilation, surrender, and you will be spared and absorbed into the empire. When it came to siegecraft, the Mongols were initially at a disadvantage. As steppe nomads, they had no tradition of building or besieging permanent fortifications. But Genghis Khan was a brilliant adopter of foreign technology. After conquering northern China, he forcibly recruited Chinese engineers who were experts in siege warfare. These engineers taught the Mongols how to build catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers. They showed them how to dig tunnels under walls, how to divert rivers to flood or drain a city, and how to construct mobile shields to protect soldiers during an assault. The Mongols became masters of siege warfare not through their own innovation, but through their willingness to learn and integrate the skills of conquered peoples. This adaptability extended to every aspect of their military. They absorbed horse archers from the Turkic tribes, heavy cavalry from the Persians, siege engineers from China, and administrative techniques from everywhere they conquered. The Mongol Empire became a vast repository of the world's knowledge, and the army was its spear tip, constantly evolving, constantly improving. So when the Mongols rode out from their homeland to conquer the world, they were not a disorganized barbarian horde. They were a professional army, superbly trained, brilliantly led, and organized in a way that gave them overwhelming tactical and strategic advantages over every enemy they faced. And the world was about to learn this lesson in the hardest way possible. The Mongol conquests began not with a grand strategy to rule the world, but with a calculated decision to secure their borders and expand their wealth. The first target was China, the ancient and wealthy empire that lay to the south of the Mongol homeland. But China was not a single unified state. It was divided into several kingdoms, the most powerful being the Jin dynasty, which controlled the north, and the Song dynasty, which ruled the south. Genghis Khan's first major campaign was against the Tangut-ruled Western Xia, a smaller kingdom that controlled the lucrative trade routes along the Silk Road. This campaign served as a testing ground for Mongol tactics and strategy. The Tanguts had fortified cities, something the Mongols had little experience with. But Genghis was patient. He laid siege to the cities, cut off their supply lines, and when they surrendered, he absorbed their engineers and learned from them. By 1210, the Western Xia was effectively a vassal state, forced to provide tribute and troops for future Mongol campaigns. With the western flank secured, Genghis turned his attention to the Jin dynasty. This was a far more formidable opponent. The Jin had a massive army, sophisticated defences, and the Great Wall, a physical barrier specifically designed to keep out steppe nomads like the Mongols. But the Jin made a critical error. They demanded that Genghis Khan submit to their authority and pay tribute. Genghis, now the undisputed ruler of the Mongol Confederation, saw this as an unacceptable insult. In 1211, he launched a full-scale invasion. The Mongols did not attack the Great Wall directly. Instead, they found weak points, bribed gatekeepers, and slipped through mountain passes that were poorly defended. Once inside, they spread out across the countryside, avoiding the fortified cities and instead targeting the agricultural heartland. They destroyed crops, killed officials and severed communication lines, creating chaos and panic. The Jin army, expecting a traditional siege, found itself unable to pin down the fast-moving Mongol cavalry. Over the next several years, the Mongols systematically dismantled the Jin state. They besieged and captured major cities like Beijing, using the siege techniques they had learned from the Tanguts and their own captured Chinese engineers. When cities resisted, they were utterly destroyed, as an example. When they surrendered, their populations were spared but absorbed into the growing empire. By 1215, Beijing had fallen. The once mighty Jin dynasty was reduced to a rump state clinging to survival in the south. But Genghis Khan did not finish them off immediately. He had his eyes on a new target, one that would lead to the Mongol Empire's most explosive expansion. To the west of the Mongol homeland lay the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Persian-dominated state that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India. It was wealthy, sophisticated, and ruled by Shah Muhammad II, a proud and ambitious man. Genghis Khan initially had no intention of conquering Khwarezm. He sent a trade caravan, a peaceful gesture intended to open diplomatic and commercial relations. But the governor of the border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, made a catastrophic decision. Believing the caravan to be a cover for spies, he seized the goods and executed the merchants. Genghis Khan sent an envoy to the Shah demanding justice and the surrender of the governor. Shah Muhammad, either through pride or miscalculation, not only refused, but executed one of the envoys and sent the others back humiliated. This was the insult that unleashed the storm. In 1219, Genghis Khan assembled an army of approximately 100,000 to 150,000 men and invaded the Khwarezmian Empire. What followed was one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history. The Mongols moved with terrifying speed, dividing their forces to attack multiple cities simultaneously. They used psychological warfare to perfection. At the city of Bukhara, after breaching the walls, Genghis Khan himself rode into the central mosque and declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The city was sacked, its wealth seized, and its craftsmen deported to Mongolia. At Samarkand, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, the Mongols used captured prisoners as human shields during the assault, forcing the defenders to kill their own people. The city fell in a matter of days. The governor, Inalchuk, the man whose actions had sparked the war, was captured and executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a symbolic punishment for his greed and blindness. Shah Muhammad fled from city to city, unable to organize a coherent defense. His empire, built on tribute and fear, collapsed as local governors either surrendered to the Mongols or tried to fight alone and were annihilated. The Shah eventually died alone, sick and humiliated, on a small island in the Caspian Sea. His son, Jalal ad-Din, proved to be a far more capable commander, fighting a brilliant guerrilla campaign and even defeating a Mongol force in open battle. But he could not stop the tide. By 1223, the Khwarezmian Empire had ceased to exist. Cities that had stood for centuries were ruins. Entire regions were depopulated. The Mongol armies, laden with plunder and driving tens of thousands of skilled captives before them, turned east and returned home. But this was only the beginning. The Mongol generals, now experienced in conquering sedentary civilizations, pushed further west. They continued their campaign into the Caucasus and then onto the steppes of Russia. In 1223, a Mongol scouting force of about 20,000 men encountered a combined army of Russian princes and their Cuman allies on the banks of the Kalka River. The Russian and Cuman force was much larger, confident in their numbers. The Mongols used their classic tactic. They feigned a retreat, drawing the overconfident enemy into a chaotic pursuit. Then, at the moment of maximum disorder, the Mongols wheeled around and struck. The Allied army was destroyed. The Russian princes who were captured were tied up, placed under wooden planks, and crushed to death as the Mongols held their victory feast on top of them. It was a grim demonstration of Mongol ruthlessness. This was not yet a full invasion, only a reconnaissance in force. The Mongols withdrew, but they had learned everything they needed to know about the lands to the west. The ground was flat, perfect for cavalry. The kingdoms were divided and weak. The defenses were outdated. The stage was set for the next wave of conquest. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, likely from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse during a campaign, his empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. But his vision did not die with him. He had established a system, trained a generation of generals, and instilled in his people a belief in their destiny to conquer the world. His sons and grandsons would carry that vision even further, and the world would tremble. The death of Genghis Khan did not mark the end of Mongol expansion. It marked the beginning of its most explosive phase. According to tradition, before he died, Genghis Khan divided his empire among his 4 sons, each receiving a large territory to rule as a khanate. But supreme authority passed to his 3rd son, Ogedei, who was proclaimed the Great Khan in 1229. Ogedei was not the warrior his father was, but he was an able administrator and, crucially, he shared his father's vision of a world empire. Under his rule, the Mongol conquests reached their greatest extent. The first major campaign was the completion of the Jin dynasty's destruction in northern China, which was finally accomplished in 1234. But the more dramatic and world-shaking campaigns were yet to come, directed westward into Europe and southward into the Islamic heartlands. In 1235, Ogedei called a great Kurultai and declared a grand campaign to the west, aimed at the fertile lands of Russia, Eastern Europe, and beyond. He placed his nephew, Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, in overall command, supported by the brilliant General Subutai, a commoner by birth who had risen through the ranks to become one of the greatest military minds in history. This was to be a campaign of total conquest. In 1237, the Mongol army, numbering over 100,000 men, descended upon the Russian principalities during the winter. European armies did not campaign in winter. The cold, the frozen rivers, the lack of forage, all made it logistically impossible. But the Mongols thrived in winter. The frozen rivers became highways for their horses, allowing them to move faster than ever. The Russian princes, divided and feuding among themselves, were unable to mount a coordinated defense. One by one, the great cities of Russia fell. Ryazan was besieged, and when it refused to surrender, it was utterly destroyed, its population massacred, its buildings burned. Vladimir, the political center of the region, fell after a brief siege. Moscow, then a minor town, was burned to the ground. Kiev, the ancient heart of Slavic civilization, was sacked in 1240 after a desperate defense. A European traveler who visited the ruins years later wrote that he could barely recognize it as a city, so complete was its destruction. The Mongols moved with terrifying speed, using their intelligence network to target the most important cities and avoid getting bogged down in prolonged sieges of minor fortifications. By 1241, the Russian principalities were subjugated, reduced to tributary states that would remain under Mongol domination for over 2 centuries, a period Russians would later call the Tatar yoke. But the Mongols were not finished. Batu Khan turned his gaze westward toward the wealthy and fractured kingdoms of Poland and Hungary. In the spring of 1241, the Mongol army split into several columns, each with a specific objective, a coordinated invasion across a front hundreds of miles wide. One force struck north into Poland. At the Battle of Legnica, they faced a coalition army led by Duke Henry II of Silesia. The European army included heavily armored knights, the elite warriors of their age, and a contingent of the famed Knights Templar. The Mongols used their standard tactics, feigned retreats, swift flanking maneuvers, and devastating volleys from their composite bows. The European knights, weighed down by their armor and trained for close combat, were helpless against the Mongol mobility. The army was destroyed, and Duke Henry was killed. According to legend, the Mongols filled 9 large sacks with the ears cut from the corpses of the dead, a grim tally of their victory. Simultaneously, another Mongol force invaded Hungary. King Bela IV assembled a large army and marched to confront the invaders at the Sajo River. Subutai, commanding the Mongol forces, orchestrated a brilliant tactical trap. While part of the Mongol army engaged the Hungarians in a frontal assault, Another force secretly crossed the river upstream and attacked from the rear. The Hungarian army was encircled and annihilated. King Bela barely escaped with his life, fleeing to the Adriatic coast. Hungary was wide open, and the Mongols spent the next year systematically plundering the kingdom. Europe was gripped with terror. Mongol scouting parties reached as far as the outskirts of Vienna. The Pope called for a crusade, not against the Muslims, but against the Mongols. But no unified defense materialized. The kings of Europe, busy with their own feuds and ambitions, failed to coordinate a response. It seemed that nothing could stop the Mongol advance. Then, suddenly, the Mongols withdrew. In the winter of 1241 to 1242, Batu Khan received news from the east. Ögedei Khan, the Great Khan, had died. According to Mongol law, all the princes of the royal family had to return to the Mongol heartland to participate in the election of the new Great Khan. Batu, though deeply invested in the European campaign, had no choice but to obey. He pulled his armies back across the steppes, leaving Europe battered but intact. This moment, the death of Ögedei, is one of history's great what-ifs. Had he lived even a few more years, the Mongol armies might have pressed on to conquer Germany, France, and perhaps all of Europe. The withdrawal was not a defeat. It was an accident of timing. But for Europe, it was a deliverance. The Mongols would never return in force. Batu Khan established his own Khanate, the Golden Horde, ruling the western steppes and the subjugated Russian principalities from his capital at Sarai on the Volga River. But the days of westward expansion were over. The empire's attention now turned south and east. While Europe had narrowly escaped, the Islamic world was about to face its greatest catastrophe. In 1251, Möngke Khan, another grandson of Genghis, became the Great Khan. He launched two major campaigns. One, led by his brother Kublai, aimed at completing the conquest of China. The other, led by his brother Hulagu, was directed at the heart of the Islamic world. Hulagu Khan's campaign was methodical and devastating. He assembled a massive army, over 150,000 men, and marched west in 1253. His first target was the Assassins, a secretive and feared order of Ismaili Shia Muslims who operated from a network of mountain fortresses in Persia, the most famous being Alamut. The Assassins had long used targeted killings to exert influence, and their reputation was legendary. But legends did not stop Mongol siege engines. One by one, their fortresses were besieged and captured. The Grand Master of the Assassins was forced to surrender and was later executed. The cult that had terrorized the region for over a century was destroyed. Hulagu then turned toward Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world. For 500 years, Baghdad had been the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of Islamic culture, learning, and political authority. It was a city of magnificent libraries, mosques, and palaces, home to hundreds of thousands of people, but its political power had long since faded. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, was weak and indecisive, more interested in luxury than military preparation. When Hulagu's envoys arrived demanding submission, the Caliph, relying on the ancient prestige of his position, refused. It was a fatal mistake. In 1258, Hulagu laid siege to Baghdad. The city's defences, outdated and poorly maintained, were no match for Mongol siegecraft. The walls were breached and the Mongol army poured into the city. What followed was one of the most catastrophic events in Islamic history. The sack of Baghdad lasted for days. Hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered. The great libraries, repositories of centuries of accumulated knowledge, were burned. According to contemporary accounts, the Tigris River ran black with the ink of destroyed manuscripts and red with the blood of the slain. The Caliph himself was captured and, according to one account, executed in a manner befitting Mongol superstition. They believed that royal blood should not be spilled on the ground, so al-Mustasim was rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed since 750 AD, was extinguished. The psychological impact of Baghdad's fall on the Islamic world cannot be overstated. It was as if Rome had fallen to barbarians. The unthinkable had happened. Hulagu pressed on, conquering Syria and moving toward Egypt. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruling Egypt and based in Cairo, was next in line. But the Mamluks were different from the armies the Mongols had previously faced. They were professional soldiers, many of them former slaves trained from childhood in the arts of war. They were highly disciplined, skilled in cavalry tactics, and above all, they were motivated by the knowledge that they were the last line of defense for Islam. In 1260, the Mongol army, now under the command of General Kitbuka after Hulagu had returned east due to the death of Genghis Khan, met the Mamluk army at Ain Jalut in Palestine. For the first time in decades, the Mongols faced an enemy that matched them in mobility and discipline. The Mamluk commander, Baibars, used a tactic the Mongols themselves had perfected. He lured the Mongols into a pursuit with a feigned retreat, then turned and struck with his main force. The battle was fierce, but ultimately the Mongols were defeated. Kitbuka was captured and executed. Ain Jalut was the first major defeat the Mongols had suffered in open battle, and it marked the limit of their expansion in the west. The Mamluk Sultanate survived, and with it, the Islamic world. Meanwhile, in the east, Kublai Khan was achieving what no Mongol leader before him had managed: the conquest of China. The Song dynasty in southern China had resisted Mongol invasions for decades, protected by their geography, their strong navy, and their wealth. But Kublai was patient, strategic, and willing to adopt Chinese methods. He built his own navy, recruited Chinese administrators, and waged a slow, grinding campaign of attrition. In 1279, after years of siege and naval battles, the last Song remnants were defeated at the Battle of Yamen. For the first time in history, all of China was under foreign rule. Kublai declared himself Emperor of China, founding the Yuan dynasty. He moved the capital to Beijing and built a magnificent new city. He became more Chinese than Mongol, adopting Confucian rituals, building temples, and ruling through a Chinese-style bureaucracy. But he never forgot his Mongol roots. His court was filled with advisors from across the empire, from Persia, Central Asia, and Europe. He encouraged trade, and the Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection. The empire that Genghis Khan had forged with blood and iron was now the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. But it was also beginning to fracture. The different Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, were drifting apart, each developing its own character and priorities. The Mongol Empire had reached its zenith, but the seeds of its decline were already sprouting. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Empire, while still vast on the map, was no longer the unified force it had been under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors. The various Khanates ruled by different branches of the royal family had effectively become independent states, often at odds with one another. The Yuan dynasty in China, under Kublai Khan's successors, faced growing internal problems. Chinese resentment against foreign rule was rising. The Mongol elite, now living in luxury, had lost much of the martial spirit that had made them conquerors. Corruption and incompetence plagued the administration. Natural disasters, floods, and famines struck repeatedly, and the government's response was weak. Rebellions began to break out across China. The most significant was led by a former Buddhist monk and peasant leader named Zhu Yuanzhang. He united various rebel factions and waged a brilliant campaign against the Mongol forces. In 1368, his armies captured Beijing, and the last Yuan emperor fled north to Mongolia. Zhu Yuanzhang declared himself the founder of the Ming dynasty. The Mongols were driven out of China, their century-long rule brought to an end. In the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia fragmented into smaller successor states after decades of internal strife. The Golden Horde in Russia, while it continued to exert control over the Russian principalities for another century, was increasingly challenged by rising powers like the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Only the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia retained some semblance of Mongol identity, but even it was splintering. The final echo of the Mongol conquests came in the form of Timur, also known as Tamerlane, a Central Asian warlord who claimed descent from Genghis Khan. In the late 14th century, Timur launched his own campaigns of conquest, attempting to rebuild the Mongol Empire under his rule. He was a brilliant and ruthless commander, and his armies carved out a vast domain stretching from India to the Mediterranean. But Timur's empire was built on his personal charisma and military genius. When he died in 1405, it too began to disintegrate. So what was the legacy of the Mongol Empire? On one hand, it was a story of unprecedented destruction. Entire cities were obliterated, millions of people were killed, and ancient civilizations were traumatized for generations. The Mongols were feared as agents of apocalypse, horsemen from a nightmare. But on the other hand, the Mongol Empire fundamentally changed the world. For the century or so that it held together, it created a zone of relative peace and stability across Eurasia, a phenomenon historians call the Pax Mongolica. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road flourished as never before. Merchants could travel from Beijing to Baghdad with relative safety, protected by Mongol law and infrastructure. This exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies had profound effects. Chinese inventions like gunpowder, the compass, and printing techniques spread westward. Islamic science and Persian art moved eastward. European travelers like Marco Polo journeyed to the court of Kublai Khan and brought back tales that expanded the European worldview. The Mongols were also surprisingly tolerant in matters of religion. Genghis Khan himself decreed that all religions were to be respected, a radical idea in an age of religious warfare. His empire included Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and followers of traditional shamanic beliefs, all coexisting under Mongol law. This cosmopolitanism fostered a vibrant exchange of ideas. The Mongol conquests also had unintended consequences. The movement of armies and merchants across Eurasia facilitated the spread of the Black Death, the bubonic plague that devastated Europe in the 14th century. Some historians argue that the plague travelled along the Mongol trade routes from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, where it then spread westward, killing a third of Europe's population. The political impact was equally profound. In Russia, Mongol rule shaped the development of the state. The Moscow princes, who collected tribute for the Golden Horde, learned administrative techniques and centralized control that they would later use to build the Russian Empire. Some historians argue that the autocratic nature of Russian governance has its roots in the centuries of Mongol domination. In China, the Yuan dynasty's brief rule left a lasting cultural impact. The Mongols brought with them new artistic influences, and the period saw a flowering of drama, poetry, and painting. The integration of China into a larger world system during this period opened it to new ideas and technologies. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Mongol Empire was the demonstration that the world was interconnected. The idea that distant lands could be reached, conquered, and integrated into a single political and economic system was revolutionary. The Mongols showed that it was possible, however brutal the methods, to create a truly world-spanning empire. In a sense, the Mongols laid the groundwork for the age of globalization that would follow centuries later. So when we look back at Genghis Khan and his descendants, we see not simply barbarians on horseback, but empire builders, innovators, and inadvertent agents of cultural exchange. They were products of their harsh environment, shaped by the brutal realities of the steppe. But they transformed that experience into a force that reshaped the world. We began this journey with a boy named Temujin, born into a world of hardship and violence, left to die on the frozen steppe. We followed his rise from outcast to warlord, from tribal leader to Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. We saw how he forged a revolutionary military machine and unleashed it upon the world, conquering an empire that stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. We explored the lives of his successors, who carried his vision to its ultimate extent, toppling ancient dynasties and remaking the map of the world. And we have seen the legacy of that empire, a complex mixture of destruction and creation, terror and tolerance, isolation and connection. The Mongol conquests were one of the defining events of human history, a moment when the world was forcibly brought together under a single banner, however briefly. The story of the Mongols challenges our simple narratives of civilization and barbarity. Were they destroyers of cultures, or were they the unintentional architects of a more connected world? The answer is both. They were the product of their time, a harsh and violent age where survival demanded ruthlessness and conquest brought glory. But they were also innovators, adapting and integrating the knowledge of every culture they encountered. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Mongol Empire is this: the world is shaped not only by the great civilizations of cities and farms, but also by the peoples of the margins, the nomads, the outsiders, those who live on the edges of settled society. When those peoples find a leader of genius, when they unite around a vision, they can change the course of history in ways that echo for centuries. Genghis Khan was such a leader, and the empire he built, for all its brutality, remains one of the most astonishing achievements in human history. The Mongols proved that with discipline, strategy, and an unshakable belief in their own destiny, a people who began with almost nothing could conquer the world. Thank you for joining me on this long journey tonight. From the windswept steppes of Mongolia to the gates of Europe and the heart of China, our voyage through history is now at an end. I hope you'll return as we continue to explore the stories found in the shadows of the past. I wish you a good rest of your day.